This video is brought to you by PPLIR Europe, a not-for-profit community of European general aviation pilots dedicated to helping ourselves and each other to use our licenses and ratings to the full. We share our passion for flying through mutual exchange of expertise, experience, information, inspiration, and education. We also assist regulators in framing legislation that affects all GA pilots. We are almost all volunteers and do it because we love it, though we do also need to raise a little money, mainly to fund our representation and lobbying activities. Please join us, improve and broaden your own flying, enjoy belonging to a community of like-minded pilots, and help us to represent you.
Welcome to this discussion on situational awareness, a topic that I hope is close to the heart of every general aviation pilot. Now, we all have our opinions about what situational awareness may or may not be, but in this talk I want to make every effort to take what I hope is an evidence-based approach, looking at the published literature in peer-reviewed journals. Over the next half an hour, we're going to cover off about 4 separate areas. Firstly, what actually is situational awareness. Second, we're going to look at what might be considered the enemies of SA, what Dr Mica Endsley, to whom I will introduce you shortly, describes as the SA demons. Thirdly, we're going to look at a situation where loss of situational awareness led to a tragic outcome. And finally, I hope to give you some tools and strategies to manage and improve your own situational awareness. Clearly, this is a big topic, and we're only going to be able to scratch the surface in approximately half an hour, but I hope to stimulate your interest to look at this subject in more detail. So, a common sense alert. I was lucky enough to partake in a share of this aircraft for a few years with a number of colleagues, and when you buy any aircraft, it comes with an FAA-approved pilot's operating manual, which includes all the information to operate the aircraft safely and within its limitations. When we talk about the human brain, unfortunately no such manual exists, so the clinical psychologists are forced to generate a model of human behavior, test it against observations, and then refine the model. I said I wanted to make this talk evidence-based, and I wanted to introduce you to Dr Mica Endsley. Dr Endsley has an extensive research background in systems engineering and human factors, and more relevant to this talk, she was a former chief scientist to the US Air Force and the first human factors engineer in that role. She's published widely, and much of this talk is based on the information published in her papers and various of her books alongside her co-workers. So, what actually is situational awareness? Dr. Endsley in 1998 defined it as the perception of the elements in the environment within a volume of time and space, the comprehension of their meaning, and the projection of their status in the near future. This could be boiled down to this very simple statement: knowing what's going on. That would be an accurate but incomplete description of optimal SA. So I want to go back to the definition and bring your attention to 3 words: perception, comprehension, projection. Dr. Endsley divides situational awareness, for the purposes of discussion at least, into 3 levels. Firstly, we have perception, which is defined as perceiving the status, attributes and dynamics of relevant elements in the environment. Once you have an adequate perception of the world around you, you can move on to understanding, which means going beyond the awareness of information towards a holistic appreciation of the significance of those elements in the light of one's goals. And finally, there is the highest level of SA, which allows the pilot to project the future, the ability to project the future status of the environment, at least in the near term. And we can think of this as an ascending triangle. Without perception, you can't really have proper understanding. And without understanding, we really aren't able to project into the future. Situational awareness is not a one-off event. It's a constant activity which starts with perception of the world around you. We then move from perception to a level of understanding, in this diagram called comprehension, and from that we can project what we think is going to happen over the immediate future. However, almost certainly we'll recognize that that projection is incomplete, and we will decide that we need more information, so we will perform a directed search of the world around us, and this is a constantly repeating process to maintain an optimal level of situational awareness. Situational awareness itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. We need situational awareness to make good decisions. When making good decisions, there are a number of factors that influence that. Firstly, there's us, what our own brains are capable of, and what we bring with our own abilities, experience, and training. Secondly, there are our goals. Our goal is presumably to complete a safe and competent IFR flight. And finally, there is the world around us that influences us, the ATC environment, weather, etc. So this is quite a complex area, and the decision making is only part of that. In the second part of this discussion, we're going to have a look at what Dr. Endsley in her publication in 2011 describes as SA demons, or things that actually get in the way of us developing good situational awareness. She actually describes 8, and in the time available in this talk, it's clearly impractical to go into all of those in detail. So I've selected just 3 to look at in a little more attention to try and get under the skin of things that can actually get in the way of us developing situational awareness. The first of those is what is known as attentional tunneling. It's probably a fairly straightforward comment to say that successful SA requires attention sharing, and it requires us to switch between different sources of information in real time. However, unfortunately, the human brain finds it particularly easy to get locked onto a single aspect, especially if that is very much, so to speak, in our face. And that may result in excellent SA for that individual aspect, but as situational awareness for all other relevant aspects rapidly becoming outdated. And Dr. Endsley recognizes this graphically as the human focusing on one data stream to the exclusion of other data streams. Secondly, complexity creep. Now, I like my fancy toys as any other pilot does, but just to give you a straightforward example, if you were to put a simple Navcom radio in your aircraft, and I have to say that other manufacturers are available, it comes with a user manual of 45 pages. If you were to purchase that device from the similar manufacturer, it comes with a user manual of approximately 405 pages. Now, I recognize that these two devices aren't equivalent, but I hope the point is made. The same goes for some of the displays in our aircraft. When I first started flying IFR, the Bendix King HSI 55 system was considered state-of-the-art, and it came with a user manual of 15 pages. I doubt whether you can buy a KCS 55 today, but you probably be much happier to have one of those in your aircraft. But again, it comes with a user manual of 53 pages, a lot more complex, especially understanding how it interacts with some of the other equipment in your aircraft. And that increases the pilot workload materially if they don't have a good understanding of the equipment fitted. They've actually got to go away and look up in their brain as exactly where this piece of information on this piece of equipment actually fits into the mental models. Coming on to mental models, we're constantly creating a mental model of the world around us, both from the external information and for the information presented to us in the modern cockpit. We take the information from the world, the information from inside the aircraft, and then feed it into our central processing unit to create what is effectively a virtual reality of the world around us. And the question that we need to always asking ourselves is, does the virtual reality inside our head actually genuinely reflect the real reality outside? And unfortunately, again, the human brain can be quite selective about the information it's prepared to accept and sometimes not challenge itself very well. Now, mental models are actually critical for building and maintaining SA, because without it, we couldn't really combine all the disparate information presented to us in real time and interpret their significance. Because it also mental models assist in developing projections of the future. So what we're doing is we're taking information from the world around us and kind of checking it against our databases of experience and saying, aha, yes, I faced a situation very similar to this before. I can use the information gleaned from that experience to apply to the current situation. And that is actually quite a powerful and very efficient way of managing situational awareness. However, it does suffer from a couple of issues. One, which you're probably familiar with, is confirmation bias. Where we've developed a mental model of the world around us, we think it's just so and we're happy with it, and then a piece of conflicting information pops up. So what do we do with that information? Do we go back to our mental model and say, that doesn't fit? Do we need to revisit the mental model? Unfortunately, the human brain is more programmed to throw that piece of information away and carry on with the current situation as it sees it. Secondly, mode errors. This is where the system, whatever it be, an autopilot, even flying an approach, is in one mode and the pilot thinks they're in another mode. To give you a very simple example, I think there are very few pilots that have not tried to fly, say, an ILS with the primary navigator in GPS mode, and it works brilliantly well when flying in terms of lateral navigation, not quite so well when it comes to flying the vertical profile. And certainly sitting in the right-hand seat as an instructor, this is probably one of the most common mode errors that we see the new IFR pilots making on a fairly regular basis. The practical problem is that it's quite insidious and difficult to break out of, because once we're inside this mental model, we need a pretty good shove to actually force us to revisit it and make sure that it is actually what we think it is. At this point, I'd like to move on to the third section of my talk, where we look at the a tragic loss of a Seneca 3 at Balmoral Airport in December 2016. Before we do so, however, you might want to pause this talk, go to the BEA website and download the final report and read it, as well as accessing the instrument approach procedures for the relevant airport. Before we move on to looking at that incident in more detail, I want to introduce you to the concept of the Dekker Tunnel. This is named after Professor Sidney Dekker, who worked in human factors and system safety at Lund University, Sweden, before moving to Brisbane, where he was the founder of the Safety Science Innovation Lab. And he also, as part of his understanding of human factors, became a qualified commercial pilot in the meantime. And he has written what I believe is the most easy to read and most straightforward book on understanding human performance and human error. To be fair, this book is written mainly from the perspective of the individual tasked with looking back at an incident and trying to make sense of it. But I would thoroughly recommend this book to you. It certainly changed my thinking about why people do the things they do. If you can't get access to the book, then I would refer you to 5 videos that Professor Dekker has put on YouTube, and these cover most of what's in the book. They're easy to find and probably could watch the whole lot in about 45 to 50 minutes. The Dekker Tunnel has become attributed to Professor Dekker, and it's the concept of you and I as individual pilots being inside this so-called tunnel of activity. And when we undertake our flying of any sort, but in this case an IFR flight, there are multiple decision points where we choose to either go left or right, and each of these results in a number of possibilities. In fact, you only see 3 on the slide in front of you, but in factual fact, there will be many, many more if each of the decision points were considered. Now, most of these will normally lead to a good outcome, and therefore no investigation would ever be made. If there's nothing gone wrong, then there's no investigation. It's only when something goes wrong and a person tasked with the analysis starts the investigation at the outcome and then works backwards up the Dekker pipe and says, aha, at this point he made this decision. The pilot zigged when he should have zagged, and at that point he zagged when he should have zigged. And then we sit with the wisdom of Buddha looking back at this situation with perfect knowledge and in a perfectly comfortable chair thinking, aha, I would have never done that. The true learning comes from starting at the other end of the tunnel and looking at the situation through the eyes of the people that were actually involved in it. What could they see? What information did they have at the time that they had to make a decision? So at this point, what information did the pilot have? Why did he zig when he zagged? And at this point, why did he zag when he zigged? So, coming back to our incident, let's look at the background. It involves an IFR flight from Nuremberg to Bâle-Mulhouse. The pilot had undertaken the outbound flight earlier in the day. The pilot was experienced, and he had flown 34 hours in the last 90 days. His total time was about just over 3,000 hours, which is a lot, but not a huge amount, and it's certainly in the ballpark of many pilots in the single pilot IFR community. The aircraft was pretty well equipped. It had an Aspen primary flight display and a Garmin GTN 650, so it was, I wouldn't call it state of the art, but it was very capable. With regard to the autopilot, there was no mention in the accident report whether the aircraft either had an autopilot fitted, or if it was fitted, whether it worked, and if it worked, whether it had approach capability. Looking at the weather, we can see that it wasn't a very nice day on returning to his home base. Particularly the RVR was 700 metres for runway 15 and decreasing. The temperature in the dew point was 0. And if we looked at the TAF for later in for that period of time, I think it is relevant to note that the forecast was actually to get worse, not better, as the evening progressed, which wouldn't be at all unusual. That might be an interesting factor in the decision making. The pilot may well have been known that although the weather on when he chose to flow the initial approach wasn't great, it wasn't likely to get worse. It was likely to get worse. So looking at the timeline, the aircraft departed at about 16:17. and some 40 minutes later or so made its first contact with BAL approach, at which point the latest RVRs were passed to the pilot, which showed touchdown 900 metres, midpoint 700, stop end 1300 metres. Now it's moot as to whether you or I would have chosen to fly this approach, but I would point out that it was actually legal. Part NCO suggests, reading of Part NCO would suggest that the minimum legal single pilot runway visual range is 550 metres. Now, I know a lot of people quote 800 metres, but if you look at Part NCO, that's actually in the guidance material, and it's highly likely that the actual legal limit is 550 metres. So anyway, the pilot chose to flow the approach, for which he was cleared at approximately 1730. 4 minutes later, he was transferred to the tower frequency. Now, my experience of flying an ILS is that you're usually transferred to the tower frequency once established on the localizer and some time before the final approach fix. So it's hard to say for certain, but he was probably on the level segment of the ILS at about 1734. And the RVRs had seemed to have deteriorated slightly even in that 10 minutes. The touchdown was 750, midpoint 650 and stop end 800, although still within the limits of 800 metres. At just after 1739, it was noted that the approach deviated from the centre line and became unstable in the vertical profile. And these are taken from the accident report, and I think it's instructive to look at the vertical profile in a little more detail. So that's a slightly zoomed in approach. And we can see that the aircraft actually started to deviate from the final approach track at this point here, when he was 390 feet above the ground. And that's interesting because actually when you look at the minima for this approach, his actual, depending on whether you think the Seneca is a Cat A or a Cat B aircraft, but it actually only makes 10 feet, he actually started to deviate from the final approach track, perhaps 140, 150 feet above the actual decision altitude. And what I've done in this particular diagram, and it is a little bit of an estimate, is to project where he would have been if, when he looked up at position 1 and perhaps had less than optimal visual references, got his head down again and continued on the ILS for another perhaps 10 to 15 seconds and then looked up again, because the aircraft would have been significantly nearer to the airport, and it may have been that he would have been able to distinguish the approach lights from the lights on the motorway next door to the airport. So we cannot get into the mind of the pilot who was flying this approach, because unfortunately he's not there to answer for himself, and we have got to be very careful about what ideas we project onto the pilot's decision making. But there seems to be strong circumstantial evidence that he, at 390 feet AGL, he looked up and in a rather gloomy night saw the much more powerful lights of the motorway off to the left, deviated to the left, and then at the last moment suddenly became aware of his error, did a rather unplanned and hurried go around, and unfortunately leading to likely a stall spin. So a tragedy, and like all tragedies, this perhaps could have been avoided if the situational awareness, he'd self-briefed himself. And it is important to note that this pilot was landing at his home-based airport. So finally, I'd like to use some of what we've learned to have a think about some tools and strategies that you might like to consider to improve and maintain your own situational awareness. So firstly, pre-flight planning. Make all reasonable efforts to understand and pre-imagine the environment you're going into, and try and work out the broad brush of the flight in advance. Where are the major decision points in the flight? Where are things that are going to need your specific attention? And certainly if it's a new flight that you've never undertaken before to a new location, just sit quietly and rehearse the flight in your own mind. Fly it in your own mind before departure. Unfortunately, the tools we have these days give us a huge amount of information about what the circumstances we're likely to encounter, and therefore we can come up with some strategies for the what-ifs. Secondly, actively work hard at being a projector, and I don't by this mean a digital video projector. I'm of course talking about level 3 situational awareness, which I will remind you is the ability to project the future status of the environment, at least in the near term. And indeed Dr Endsley's research shows, when looking at the difference between private pilots and commercial pilots, that commercial pilots do have a reproducible tendency to seek out more sources of information and to try and project farther ahead. And this was consistent in her observations in a study performed in a simulator. Plan for contingencies, the what-ifs. Are there any uncertainties in the flight? Are there any pinch points which might require a material change to the plan if things don't work out? Quite a lot of our members have, because of the various airports we fly from, undertake transitions between VFR and IFR and between VMC and IMC, and anecdotal evidence suggests that these are potentially quite problematic, because, for example, in the transition from IFR to VFR, you've got to take over your own terrain awareness, and the same in the opposite direction. Be proud of being a nerd. I don't think a nerd should be considered a pejorative word, and by nerd I mean study and know your aircraft in detail, including its checklists and systems. One of the downsides of GA is we have so many choices now of various displays, radios, data sources. How all that is hooked up together gets increasingly complex, and if you don't have a good and working knowledge of how the systems in your aeroplane actually work, you're not only increasing your own workload significantly, but you are increasing the risk of what's known as a Widden moment, known in the trade as a what's it doing now, usually when the autopilot takes the aircraft off in some direction that you hadn't perhaps anticipated. Almost certainly it will, these days with modern autopilots, which are on the whole fairly reliable, it won't be the autopilot. The autopilot will be doing exactly what you have asked it to do. Study the instrument procedures for a given airport in advance and read the small print. I would refer you back to the approach plates for BAL for runway 15, and on both the Jefferson and the AIP plate there is a note to say be aware that the approach lights on the runway 15 can be subject to confusion with the lights on the motorway next to the airport. Now, what I don't know, of course, is whether that has been modified because of the result of the accident we've discussed. Have a personal SOP for when things aren't right or don't feel right. trust to some extent your intuition. Now, I realise we can't kind of pull over on the side of the road, but there are strategies that we can use to slow down and have a think about whether we're doing the right thing. I don't think ATC are ever going to say over the radio, no, you can't hold if you need some time to sort something out. This is but one acronym which is widely used in situations where circumstances aren't quite working out as you'd expected. Other acronyms are of course available, but this is widely used and recommended. Never, ever, ever let the aeroplane take you where your brain hasn't been 5 minutes before. And here, of course, I'm talking about projection, the ability to kind of look into the future and make sure that what is happening is what you expect to happen. And I'm going to leave the final words to Frank Borman, who was the mission commander of Apollo 8, which gave us that famous photograph from the 1960s. And he said that. So in summary, we've had a look at what actually is SA. We've touched on SA demons, the enemy of SA. We've kind of pulled that together in an incident where there was a tragic outcome resulting from a loss of SA, and hopefully I've given you some tools and strategies to manage and improve your own situational awareness. Finally, if you aren't a member of PPLI Europe, I would strongly recommend you to become one. This is the whole purpose of PPLIR, to share and learn together. Thank you for your time and attention.